Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth and final installment of Preservation Connecticut's Fall 2021 series, talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm happy to be your host today as we chat with Nick Bellantoni, State Archaeologist Emeritus, and our topic is vampire folk belief in Connecticut. But before I hand the controls over to Nick, let me give you a little background about Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. The Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation was founded to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Preservation Office, and I am proud to say that for over 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. And last year, in 2020, we rebranded ourselves as Preservation Connecticut. Our office is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, Connecticut, and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Shown here, it's the Eli Whitney Boarding House, built in 1827 to house workers for Eli Whitney's gun factory, and it served as our headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 8 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren is our deputy director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our newly launched Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey Project, and to arrange book talks for his recently published book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert, Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to State and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood, Development Assistant, manages all of the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, and Stacy Vero provide immediate response to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations, and museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, and funding. These weekly chats have served as a meaningful way for us to continue our mission during the pandemic. We've been able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions or ask questions directly at the end of the presentation. And you can certainly contact us afterwards if you need a site visit or follow-up information. And as I said, this will be the last of our fall series, but we look forward to offering a winter series. And if you have any suggestions about topics you'd like to hear about, please feel free to let us know. So now, without further ado, I'm excited to turn the controls over to Nick. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, well, thank you, Jen, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I am going to share my screen so I can put my slides up. And let's see. How's that? Good for everybody?
Perfect.
Excellent. So first of all, it's great to be here for you guys. And, you know, we go back with then the Connecticut Trust and now Preservation Connecticut for a long, long time. Ever since I came on board over 30 years ago as the state archaeologist, and really have had a wonderful relationship and have really thankful to Preservation Connecticut for the work they've done to preserve archaeological ruins, and some of which, in the state of Connecticut. So it's been a great relationship, and we're happy to be here for you guys. And I guess my job is to start your Halloween off a little bit early. So if I do that, I hope you will forgive me if I take kind of a scientific approach to all of this. After all, we're looking at archaeological evidence, so we're gonna do that. But hopefully, interest you in a vampire folk belief that existed in New England for well over 100 years, and saw its evidences in the ground as part of an archaeological rescue. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So what I like about doing this presentation is that it allows me to kind of a way, and a kind of a sensational and popular way, to teach science. Because in order to solve the issue that we had, and basically it was the uncovering of a historical burial where the individual, instead of being anatomical in his grave, he had been rearranged. And so to understand what we were seeing took not only forensic archaeology, the work we did in the field, obviously history, going back to the history books to understand what was going on there. We even incorporated American and English literature, forensic anthropology, the study of the bones themselves that we were uncovering, and even getting into folklore to try to come together to answer the question of what we were seeing and how we would interpret that. So what I want you to appreciate also as we get started here is what we do. We are anthropological archaeologists, long words, right? Big title. But what it basically means is that when we do archaeology, it's not just a matter of collecting artifacts, things that, we could put in museums and so forth. But basically, we take an anthropological approach. That means we are basically the systematic study of human behavior in the past. We use material culture. We use the things we dig up, from stones to bones to historic ceramics. And we try to tell the story of the past through that, working in historic sites, certainly working with the state's historians. But basically, our ultimate goals are to understand human behavior, okay? So it's not a matter of excavating, stone arrow points as curiosities of the past. It's what those points in relationship to other artifacts in the ground teach us about the lives of people, in this case, Native Americans, that have been here for thousands of years, okay? So we're interested in human behavior. And in terms of what we're talking about today, we're really basically talking about a cultural context of a thought world, a world people believed and as a result acted upon, okay? So those thought whales take out a kind of a reality because of human behavior, okay? So that's what we're going to get into, an archaeological, anthropological context for thought worlds in the 19th century. So it all starts really basically in the fall of 1990. And it amazes me, I've been telling this story for 30 years now, and it's going to outlive me, believe me. But it started in a sand and gravel operation in the town of Griswold, Connecticut. And basically they were mining this high 50-foot knoll of sand and gravel, trucking the material out for construction purposes. Well, they stopped work on a Friday. On Saturday, there was a light rain. On Sunday, 3 10-year-old boys come to the gravel pit to play. They're sliding down the banks, having a good old time. When one slide down, a skull dislodges and tumbles down the hill with the boys. And they freaked right out. Let me tell you, one kid goes running home to his mother and says, Mom, there's skulls in the gravel pit. She says, get out of here. You watch too much television. So the kid went back to the gravel pit, picked up the skull, and he brought it home, to which she bounced off the wall. But she did, after she bounced off the wall, of course, she did the right thing. And the right thing is she called the police immediately. And the police actually came down and rooked off the gravel bank as a crime scene because they had no idea of what they were looking for. And in fact, when I finally found working with the state police and looked at their initial records of the discovery, they thought that it may be a serial killer by the name of Michael Ross. Back then, Michael Ross had murdered a number of young women in New York and New England, and all of the victims had not been identified yet. So that was the first theory. But when the medical examiner looked at the remains, they could see that there's kind of cortical loss, that is a decomposition, that the bones were in fact old and not part of a modern criminal investigation. And that's when they contacted me up at the University of Connecticut. And I came down and concurred with the findings, and then went down to Griswold to the scene. And at this point, because it was not a modern criminal investigation by state legislation, the investigation is now turned over to the state archaeologist. So when I arrived at the gravel bank, what I saw immediately, and I don't know if you could follow my cursor here, but you could see these dark stains, kind of rectangular stains coming off the cliff wall, okay? So I saw those were archaeologists call features, and there were 6 of them lined up along the bank. And I realized right away what had happened, and that is that they had hit the first row of a colonial graveyard nobody knew was up there, okay? You dig a hole, you displace the soils, you put the coffin down, and then you fill the hole back in with the back dirt. And what you do is, instead of this nice horizontal strata of soil profile, you mix and model it. You change the coloration of the soil, you change the compaction of the soil, you even change the chemistry of the soil. So I could see these stains and realized that they had hit the first row of an old graveyard. Of course, I wasn't too much of a genius, because at the bottom of these things, some bones were sticking out and some coffin parts. So, you know, but I figured I'd tell you about the stains anyway. But we realized right away that we were in an old colonial graveyard. And here you could see is, this is not happened a long time ago, so my slides aren't very good, but you could see this kind of dramatic image of an individual that were excavating in their coffin. The skeletal remains just coming through, and there's less than a foot of soil here before there's a gully that drops down 50 feet. So it's kind of interesting. We had to rescue these individuals before they eroded, and yet, recover them, hopefully in a professional and respectful way, that we can reconstruct their history and do the forensic work to understand who in fact they were and about their lives. And that bank, that cliff bank of fine sand and gravel was so fragile that the weight of the archaeologists, of us, on that bank edge was contributing to the erosion as we were working. So it was kind of a delicate dance we had to do to do our work as efficiently as possible, but also not contribute to the erosion. Well, one of the things I wanted to know immediately was, who are these people? And so I had sent some researchers into the Griswold Town Hall, where they were eventually able, and also working with the city of Norwich, to come up with some land deeds. I wanted to trace the land back of this particular spot as far as we could. Well, in doing so, they found a land deed dating to 1757, in which a Nathaniel Walton purchases the top of this hill for the purposes of burying his family. It's right there in the deed, 1757. So, in modern development, they only have to take deed research back, I think, 50 years or whatever it might be. They don't need to go back to the middle of the 18th century. But as researchers here, we took it back as far as we could and found they would have known that there was a graveyard or suspected one. I should tell you that when they were doing this work, they did not recognize that there was a cemetery there. There were no engraved tombstones. This was simply, these were unmarked graves, and in some cases may have had small field stones set up, sometimes only a couple of inches off the ground, that they certainly didn't recognize. But doing the land deed, we now focused in on the Walton family. Doing further research, we found out that they settled in Griswold in 1692. The family stayed on the land for 4 generations. They literally, farmed it the entire 18th century. And then at the turn of the 19th century, as the West was opening up, and the Western Reserve in Northeast Ohio became available to Connecticutans, the Waltons were one of the families that went out there and resettled in Ohio to farm that less stony and certainly a lot flatter land out there. So we lose the Waltons at that time, but would come to find out that another family would start using the same cemetery that the Waltons had left behind in the 19th century. But I just want to give you, before I get into that, I want to give you a little idea of how we excavate these kinds of features. So you remember I showed you the profiles? This is what that same feature looks like in terms of the coming down horizontally from the top of the gravel bank. And you could see the rectangular stain. This is to the left here, you could see the clear natural soil of that horizon, and then the mixed mottled soils. So one of the first things we did is I had my students and volunteers scrape the tops of the soil. Now, because it was prepared for sand and gravel mining, they had already deforested. They already had trucked the topsoil out. So we were already dealing with the subsoil, and hence these stains really now came out very clearly, as you can see in this slide. And when we did that, we found that we had over 30 stains to deal with. That is to say, 30 burials that were still up on this hill. Once we know where the grave is in terms of the burial feature of the grave shaft, we could excavate down. And then, it depends on the degree of preservation. You could see in this case, you could actually see the outline of the old hexagonal coffin. Okay, these are wooden coffins. The wood's gone, deteriorated, rotted. There's nothing to pick up. But if you do, hopefully you do your work carefully enough, you could actually see the soil stain that was once the sideboard of that rotted and decomposed coffin. And also map associated coffin nails that are associated with keeping the boards together. But note the mixed model soils inside here, and then the clear, undisturbed stratigraphy next to it. And you could see it going up the side wall. So you've got a clear grave shaft and now evidence of a wooden coffin. Once we know where the coffin is, we could excavate down into the human remains. And the way it usually is situated is, in these cases, these are Christian burials. They were laid on their back. As you come down horizontally, the first, the highest level you're going to see in the human body is literally the forehead or the top of the cranial vault. And sometimes you see a darker coloration of the soil as you get closer to the skeletal remains. And when we excavate, we excavate with very carefully. We do not use, for example, metal tools because metal can scrape the bone. We use bamboo wooden picks and certainly brushes. It's very delicate work. The bone is in various states of preservation. In some cases, so porous, it's almost like the texture of butter as you move alongside of it. So working carefully is the only way we could really recover as much information as possible. And you can see here, we wear surgical gloves and masks. This is not necessarily because of health issues. There really are none on this kind of an excavation. We do have concerns when we deal with metal coffins and opening up metal coffins that could trap pathogens that could be a danger. But the reason we're doing this is for the potential of DNA analysis, okay? So the problem is the archaeologists working on the bones themselves can actually place their own DNA by breathing on it and handling it. So we need to be careful we don't contaminate the sample. Because if we do the work and we find out that the Waltons are from Italy, I'm in a lot of trouble, guys, all right? So then we work ourselves down to the skeleton itself. And, it's very important to keep everything intact so we could see how the skeleton is laid out. And then there's also the forensic aspects of the human skeleton. When I used to talk about this years ago, people really were amazed at what we could tell from a skeleton. But now that you've seen Bones on TV and CSI and all of this, it probably less surprising or whatever to you. But let me just say that that the skeleton that's inside you is not just simply hard tissue that keeps you upright and protects your vital organs. It does that, but it's also living tissue. So as a result, it modifies to your life, much like your soft tissue, muscles and skin and so forth. So when we analyze the skeleton, we could tell the age and sex of the person. We could tell the degree of nutrition a person has gotten in their lifetime based on growth and development we see. And sometimes in the teeth where we may see something called enamel hypoplasia, which is a disruption of the growth of your enamel, just like the growth on the rings of a tree, that may be disrupted because of nutritional stress, that you're not getting a proper diet. So we see some of that. We see the degree of exercise a person gets. If you go to the gym and work out and you think you're doing it for whatever purpose you want to do, you probably the last thing you think about is building your bone, but that's what it's doing also. Because with exercise and manual labor, you build bone density, the musculature, the attachments, where the muscles come into the bone need to respond. The bone needs to get bigger, more rugged. You could actually determine the degree of musculature on an individual based on their skeleton. And we see these in the males here where their bones are really massive. These were farmers. They worked hard. They built stone walls. And you could see that play out within their bodies. Some disease states are possible to determine from hard tissue. However, not all are. We'll show you a case in this presentation where they are. Life stress pathology. The men in this sample all had arthritic condition in their joints and mainly in their vertebral backbone column. So hard life, and it gets again played out. Trauma, broken limbs that have healed or not healed are pretty easy. Cause of death, we could tell only because of trauma, okay? I could tell that maybe that a person has suffered from a certain disease, and the chances are they died from that disease, but I can't prove that. The only time I could prove in a court of law that a cause of death is through trauma severe enough to cause that death. We could tell if a person's right-handed or left-handed. In some women, sometimes it's possible to determine if they've gone through childbirth, and sometimes we're even able to estimate the number of children she had. Measure the long bones and you've got stature. You could estimate the height of the individual. And of course, with DNA now, we get a better glimpse of biological ancestry that we could take back through time. So, that old saying, dead men tell no tales? Forget about it. Dead men tell a lot of tales if you know how to read the bones. In fact, one of the more notable forensic anthropologists once said, the thing about skeletal bones is bones never lie. Witnesses do, but bones never lie, and they tell the story. So it is not only the forensic aspects, but it's also the mortuary practice. These people, as I mentioned, were laid out in a Christian mortuary practice on their backs with an east-west orientation, head to the west. The idea is that as you lay in the grave, you are facing the east, and Christ will come up with the sun out of the east on the day of resurrection and remove you from your housing. So you are prepared by facing that way and ready to get up with the rising Christ. This is a classic pattern. If you go to the old cemeteries in your town, take a compass if you need it, but go out there, you'll note that the stones are aligned where the headstone and footstone, if there is one, are aligned east-west with head to the west. That usually means, and it's not in every case, but usually means when you read that tombstone, here lies Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan's not in front of the stone, but he's actually behind the stone with his feet moving away, facing the east, okay? So this is a classic pattern. Today, we don't do this. Today, we, in cemetery, we put you in like a subdivision, as many plots as we can get in now. We don't, that's all they think. But back then, it was important to be laid out in that Christian pattern. Also, another thing is in Judeo-Christian tradition, it's your soul that goes on. You can't take it with you, so to speak. So these graves are usually deplete of any funerary objects, okay? The thing we did find, other than coffin hardware, were very small straight pins, and what they were used for was to keep a shroud, a linen shroud together. These people were buried naked, no boots, buckles, or buttons, but they were buried with a sheet or a shroud surrounding them when they were laid in the ground. And we find the pins, very small pins associated with that. So we learn about belief systems. We learn about what people are, how they're treating their dead and preparing their dead, in this case, for the afterlife. So as we continue to excavate, everything gets measured, photographed, forms are filled out. Each skeletal element is taken out separately and carefully, packaged to be brought to the university laboratories for full-scale forensic analyses. And when we were done, this is our map of the Wilton Cemetery. The dotted line you see going across on the top, well, that's the cliff. And you could see some of the bodies have already been affected by the erosion. And if you go down here and you see number 15, that I believe is our Nathaniel Walton, who started this cemetery for his family back in 1757. However, the burials we're really concerned about are here on the top right with letters NB, IB, and JB. So when I got to the gravel bank, as I mentioned before, I saw the 6 stains, but next to one of them, or at the bottom of one of them, there was these bricks coming out of the side wall. And this would have been to the far extreme left on the slide, looking up at just that little box, what appeared to have been a brick box. And at first I wasn't sure quite what I had was looking at. I thought maybe it housed a tombstone or something, but when we excavated back, as you could see in the slide, it was a crypt. They had laid the coffin down. They built a single row of bricks around it, 7 bricks high, and then they covered it with flat field stones that you see laying off to the top. So they enclosed the crypt. So being in charge of the excavation, I had the responsibility of opening the crypt. And so I took those stones off and I looked down into the darkened lid of the coffin. It had been painted black, was very well preserved considering. It had two hinges up here around the shoulder. And that's so during the funeral process, you could lift the head portion up without having to pick the whole body board up. And you could view the face during the funeral. But below that cut, they had taken brass tacks and they hammered the initials of the person laying there. And the initials were NB. Now, I wasn't too thrilled because those are my initials. So I open up the crypt and I see my initials on the coffin, and I'm not a happy camper here. And then underneath the initials NB is the number 13 arranged in brass tacks. And I'm not too thrilled about that either. So, but regardless of how I felt, I said to my students, I said, we've got a problem here. We're supposed to be in the Walton family cemetery. Now we have a B surname. Who are these individuals? And so we took that information back and did some more genealogical work on the family. We were doing that ongoing while we were in the field. We had the genealogists and others working with us, getting genealogical data. Anyhow, one of my students comes running into my office up at UConn, all excited. He said, I got him. I said, who do you have? He said, I found a Nathaniel Bennett, NB, married into the Walton family in 1794. I said, I like it. I said, can you associate the number 13 with Nathaniel Bennett? And he said, I've got that too. It turns out he died on October 13th. And I wasn't thrilled because that's my birthday. So this guy has my initials. He dies on my birthday, and I'm digging him up. The good news is when I lifted the coffin and looked at the skeletal remains, he wasn't a short, dark Italian, and I knew it wasn't me, so I was happy about that. But it turns out it's not Nathaniel Bennett. The person laying here is 13 years of age. Based on the genealogy, Nathaniel Bennett had married into the family. They had 6 kids. Of course, it could be one of his children. That we don't know, didn't know at this time. But the fact was, this was not Nathaniel Bennett. This was a 13-year-old adolescent in a B family. Laying next to him is IB, initials on her coffin, an adult woman, 46 years of age. And if you can look here, she is not decapitated because the crania is missing. This is the skull that rolled down the hill with the boys. We were able to match it up with her postcranial remains. The only part of her, she had no crypt, no brick crypt. The only part of her remains that, of her coffin, I should say, that preserved is in the pelvic area here where the brass tacks were forming on the lid of the coffin. So the brass tacks leach kind of salts into the soil as it breaks down, and it neutralizes the soil acidity around it. And as a result, the pieces of wood preserve around it where the rest of the wood had long decomposed. But laying next to her now is a third member of this family, a JB55, an adult male. He is in a stone-lined crypt. Now, this slide was taken earlier, but excuse me, you could see a stone here. There would have been another bridging stone on this side, and then a stone closure arching over. And when I saw that eroding out of the bank, when I first got to the gravel bank, I had recognized that because I had seen stone crypt. This was the first time I had ever seen a brick crypt. So I recognized that this was a stone crypt. And when I went up along the gravel bank, I peered in with a light. This would have been all enclosed at that time to kind of look in. And instead of seeing the back of the cranium or skull as I had expected, I saw the face. And you could see the face twisted here, facing out. And I thought, man, that's kind of peculiar. That's not an anatomical position. However, in robust men, sometimes they have a kind of a bun in the back where the occipital torus extends. And so with decomposition, the cranium could roll very easily in the grave. So I thought it odd, but not terribly odd. And then we started our excavation from the top down. So here you see this is the gravel bank. If you follow my cursor, this is all the way in the distance. And here we're excavating down onto those stone crypt arching. And when we are excavating down, I found 2 skeletal elements, a lower arm bone, an ulna, and a lower backbone, a lumbar vertebra on top of the stones. And I said to myself, geez, this guy should be inside the crypt. Why am I finding body parts outside the crypt? And I didn't realize until we opened the whole thing up, and what we saw was an individual that had been completely rearranged in his grave. This is, hopefully you could make out this. When we opened the foot of the coffin, the feet and the tibia or shin bones were in perfect anatomical position. But when we opened up further up the anatomy, the femur or thigh bones were not in their anatomical position, but it had been uprooted and crossed over the chest area. The chest had been violated, that is to say, the ribs had been broken into, and the cranium, now the skull, we could see had been deliberately decapitated and rotated away. And I was utterly befuddled by what I was looking at. I had never seen anything like this. And to be honest with you, I've never seen anything since like this. But one of the things I was able to note in the field, and if you go follow the cursor again, this is the distal femur, or where the near your upper knee joint, if you will, where the knee joint comes in. Okay, there's a fracture there, if you can make this out. Okay, and when I looked at the signature of that fracture, I realized that whatever happened here happened 4 or 5 years after this guy died. This guy JB dies. Okay, because if this had happened immediately after death, that signature on the bone, the way that bone cracked, would be a lot different than the eroded bone we saw. That means it had already started to kind of decompose before it was violated. So here's what we were putting together in the field, that this guy JB, whenever he died, and we figured, based on the coffin, it was the early 19th century, was given a good Christian burial. And then 4 to 5 years afterwards, somebody comes back in, digs into his grave, opens up his coffin, rearranges his bones, and closes it all back up again. And so the question is, what was going on here? My first thoughts were vandalism. I said, well, maybe they went back in to steal jewelry or something. But, you can never use negative evidence in archaeology. If it's not there, it's not there. You can't invent that it once was there, okay? However, when we looked at all those other graves that we excavated, there was nothing in them but shroud pins. So there was made no sense to me that this guy would have been buried in anything special, that they would have come in and done this to him. And if they were going to steal jewelry or something that this guy was buried with, they didn't have to rearrange him and decapitate him the way they did. So this was not a very satisfying hypothesis, and I discarded it rather quickly. But when we were out there, one of my colleagues said to me, have you ever heard the story of the Jewett City Vampire? And I said, no. And Jewett City, by the way, is part of Griswold, and about 3 miles from where we made the discovery of the Wilton Cemetery. So he proceeded to tell me the story of the Jewett City Vampire, which takes place really in the mid-19th century. And it deals with the Ray family, who was experiencing an epidemic of consumption within their family. Now, consumption, what they called consumption, we call today tuberculosis. It was called consumption because tubercular victims, were kind of, how do you want to say, they appeared to be wasting away. A disease that they coughed and they brought up blood, and they ate, but they got thinner and paler. And Keats and Shelley and all the Romantic poets were, they wanted, and some of them died of tuberculosis or consumption. But this thing of being consumed and wasting away of the victims. Well, in 1845, a 24-year-old son in the Ray family, Lemuel, contracts the disease and he dies. They bury him in the Jewett City Cemetery. 4 years later, his father, Henry Ray, comes down with the disease. He dies. They bury him in the cemetery. 4 years from there, in 1854, 2 years later, in 1851, another son comes down with the disease, dies, is buried in the cemetery. And then finally, in 1854, the eldest son, Henry Jr., becomes stricken with the disease. Now, at this point, the family's desperate. They're losing. They've already lost 3 of the men in their family to this disease. And the disease, they had no idea how it was being transmitted. This was before germ theory. The doctors could not help them. The churches could not help them. All that we knew is people were dying, and especially within family compounds. It was spreading. We know today germ theory and what happens. with transmission of diseases, but they had no idea back then. So when everything failed, there was a folk belief that was really brought over by German and Eastern European doctors that said basically that the dead who died of these diseases could remain undead in their coffins, if you will, have the ability to leave the housing of the grave and feed on living family members and hence spread the disease. So the potion here is to go into the graves and determine which one of your relatives, deceased relatives, is mischievous, is literally a vampire. So the father and the two brothers who had died previously were dug up, not only by the members of the Ray family, but the community. There were many people here that came to watch to see if one of if the father or one of the brothers remained undead. And Alicia, the one who had died more recently in 1851, only 3 years earlier, when they went into his grave, they found that he had a fresh heart. Well, what that meant is his heart was decomposing. All that soft tissue was already in a state of decomposition. But because he was the more recent burial, the decomposition hadn't totally occurred. So his heart looked like it had blood in it. They took that as a sign that he was still alive. He was undead. So they burned him. They burned his heart. They burned his whole remains right in the grave, with the idea that it would help young Henry no longer being preyed upon. Young Henry died anyway, a few months later. Well, I said, this is a most interesting story. You have any more like this? And they said, well, there's another one about Mercy Brown in Exeter, Rhode Island, this time in 1892. And this time within the family, it appears to be the women that are suffering from the disease. So this does not take on any, male, female. Anyone could be a vampire that remains undead in their grave, regardless of gender. So in this case, a mother and a sister died, Mercy, of consumption. They are buried in the cemetery. And their brother, Mercy's brother, Edwin, comes down with the disease. He's terminal. He's even gone out west to try to find some cures, and he comes back and he's dying. And so it is decided that the only way to save Edwin would be to find out which one of his mother or his sister remains undead in their grave. Mercy had just died only about a year or two ago. She was completely, almost very fresh in her grave. They took that as a sign that she was still alive. Now, the local doctor looked at her when they opened up the grave, and he said, this is a normal state of decomposition, but nobody else would believe him. They believed, in fact, that she was a vampire. So they removed her heart. They burned it on the blacksmith's anvil, if you will, in his furnace. They made a potion out of it, and Edwin drank it. And he died 6 months later also. In each one of these cases, too, there's a degree of rearrangement of the bones, but not a great deal. So I started to get into, could this develop this hypothesis? Could what we see in this guy, JB, be a factor of this vampire folk belief that was going on in the 19th century? And this is when we were able to connect with Michael Bell, a folklorist in Rhode Island, who took me to this cemetery deep in the woods in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. And he showed me this beautiful slate tombstone of a Simon Whipple, a young man who died at 27 years of age in 1841. And what he particularly wanted to show me was the base of the tombstone where the epitaph was located. And if you could follow my cursor here, it says consumption's vampire grasp. And that was the first time we'd ever seen the concept of consumption and a vampire within the same line. And we wanted to know the full verse here, even though we couldn't go down into the ground because it had been re-cemented many years ago. But we worked with our colleague, Dr. Faye Ringel, then a professor at Coast Guard Academy in English literature, and she found a book called Black Sister, a poetry book written by poems of Black American women from the mid-18th century right into the late 20th century. And she found a poem dedicated to the memory of J. Horace Kimball. And part of that poem reads, although consumption's vampire grasp, just as we saw in the tombstone, had seized thy mortal frame, thy ardent and inspiring mind, untouched, remained the same. In other words, a vampire can get your body, he can get your mortal frame, and he could destroy it, but he can't touch your mind. He can't touch your spirit. They remain the same, even in death. So this concept now, is taking more of a hold. Michael is finding more and more evidence of this going on in New England from documents he was finding. In some cases, court records, some cases, town records, where families say they want to go into the graves of their young loved ones who died and were buried in a town cemetery, town burying ground, so they can conduct an experiment. And the experiment, of course, is what was being prescribed by European doctors to go into the graves and find out who is undead and develop. So we looked at European oral tradition, and certainly these thoughts are still in Eastern Europe today. And then we found something kind of cool. We found a copy of the Connecticut Current. Now, if you know, the Connecticut Current is today the Hartford Current, and it is the oldest and longest running, continuously running newspaper in the United States. And we found a headline, the front page, Monday, January 21st, 1765. You can't read it, but follow the cursor. The headline is Vampires. And it tells the story of the undead and how they could spread diseases. So 1765, the idea, the cultural, how do you want to say, folk belief is already in New England. Now, we don't have any vampire cases going back that far, but when consumption becomes epidemic and so many people were being affected and dying, maybe, just maybe, this was going to be helpful. And this was the case. So it's associated with vampirism, we believe, coming over from Europe, where there's, you exhume the dead to conduct experiments, evidence of blood in the heart, burning of the heart, rearrangement of the skeleton, including decapitation. All prescriptions coming over from Europe at this time, especially later on when the Hessian soldiers come in with the American Revolution. You get an influx of now these ideas that, again, may not have been acted upon until people were desperate. And that's the thing I want you to understand here. This is not, Bela Lugosi and going into a grave in the middle of the night and so forth, or Igor with a hump on his back. This was a public health issue. People were dying. They could not stop the dying. The fear of death and the fear of losing loved ones was so strong. When the doctors failed them, when the churches failed them, maybe, just maybe, this might work, or at least we should try it. People in desperation. And I will say to us today, we're hopefully on the downside of this COVID business and this virus. And we have the benefits of a marvelous medical technology that, helps us with vaccines, teaches us that we need to wear masks in public places, we need to avoid crowds, to do all the things that science tells us to do, which appears to be very helpful and is working. However, if it didn't work, people are going to do irrational things, irrational behaviors, simply out of love and fear, the fear of losing their loved ones and even themselves. And that's what this was. This was love and this was fear. Just maybe it might work. So Michael Bell, in his research, Michael has been doing this. He was on the trail of the vampires long before I came along. And at this point, when he made this map, he had over 20 cases in New England. Now, these were historic newspaper accounts, family diaries, folklores handed down to families, as well as town records, official records. Ours remains the only archaeological record of possibly the vampire folk plague. So how do we test this now? How do we figure this out if this JB was thought to be a vampire? So listen, regardless of what my students think, I wasn't there in the 19th century. I'm just not really that old. But what we do as archaeologists is we develop what's called test implications, okay? We develop a hypothesis and we test it based on what we find in the ground. Now, we know, based on Michael's research primarily, that the vampire folk belief was really prevalent for about 100 years. Got a couple of cases before 1790, and Michael's even found a couple of cases into the 20th century. But basically 1790 to 1890 is the real high spot for this. In every case that Michael could uncover, it is affecting rural farming families. He did not find a single case that involved an urban setting. Predominantly, there's a hot spot in western Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut, Vermont and New Hampshire also, even though every New England state has some kind of vampire connection. In every case in New England, the suspected vampire dies of consumption or tuberculosis. And finally, to take care of that individual, to make sure they're no longer mischievous, they remove the heart, there's burning, and sometimes rearrangement in the grave. So those are our test implications. First thing we need to do is look at JB and a kind of a forensic analysis of JB. You could see he has an interesting smile. But basically, he's actually, for a 55-year-old male in New England in the early 19th century, he's got a really good set of teeth in his mouth. Most people never saw a professional called a dentist. Many never even owned a toothbrush. Oral hygiene was unheard of. I have seen skeletons of young people in their 20s, and they're already losing their teeth from periodontal disease, literally rotting out of their mouths. Cavities, caries are in every mouth, and again, with no dental attention. They ate, diets high in carbohydrates and sugars, and their teeth literally are rotting. I used to say, if you ever need any impetus to floss, come to my laboratory and I'll give you all the impetus you need to take care of yourself. But actually, he's doing pretty good. You could see he's very rugged. You could see the pronounced brow features here. He's got a thin nasal aperture, which really tells us that from good nose for Europeans. And this is a facial, by the way, in the lower right, a facial reconstruction we had done with our colleagues based on the skull at the Smithsonian Institution many, many years ago. In profile, you could see that good nose coming out here. He's got a good European brow ridge. Is very rugged individual, very rugged individual. His body bones, when we went through those, we found evidences of that arthritic condition I told you about. His backbones were littered with arthritis. This guy was a hard working man, and it played out in his skeleton. And also, and you could see the arthritis and the flattening of the central body here, and the overlapping limping of the arthritic condition. His back must have been extremely painful. Movement had to be very difficult. But we also found, and this is his clavicle or collarbone, that This bone growth here is from the result of a fracture. He broke his collarbone. There's a bone spur coming out on the distal end. He also broke a rib and scraped up his knee pretty badly. All healed. That is to say, this guy suffered a fall, I think, all on his left side. He may have fell off a horse, a wagon, we have no idea. But he sustained a fractures on his left side that all healed. He lived at least 5 or 6 years after that trauma and before he finally would die. But, you know, he went through a lot of trauma. He went through a lot of pathology. Hard-working man. And the difficulties of farming and that lifestyle play out on his body. So 55-year-old adult male, we know that from the coffin, and that matched up his bones fairly well. European ancestry, healed fractures. When we did his stature, he was 6 feet tall. That's pretty good back then, you know, for someone to be 6 foot. But the key thing we found was that he suffered from tuberculosis. And we know that because his left ribs, the interior, if you were the anterior, but it would be the interior, if you will, in terms of it, the portion of the rib adhering to the lung, it shows these white lesions, these kind of stains, which are a typical signature of a pulmonary disease like tuberculosis. If it's not tuberculosis, it's very similar to it. And you could see here are some of JB's, you could see them better, the lesions here near the head of the rib that are indicative of consumption. So when we look at the hypothesis, we have to take into consideration some of the support. So when we look at the burial rearrangement, well, it's kind of consistent with folk beliefs methods, especially those coming from Europe. When we look at the cemetery where we found this, it's in a rural eastern Connecticut. It's not in an urban setting. These were farmers. It's 2 miles from Jewett City, where a reported vampire event occurred. Dating the hardware on the coffin, the temporal period is anywhere between, you know, 1780 and 1830 or so, 1840. So it's really early 19th century. Which is right in the time period that Michael had defined. And of course, the key was that the individual has tuberculosis. And whether he died of that, again, remember, I can't tell, but he did suffer from it, okay? The only thing that's really peculiar here within the vampire hypothesis is that it's a really dramatic rearrangement. We don't have any accounts of this kind of uprooting of bones and crossing them over going on. And I think what's happened is that because they came back into this grave 4 to 5 years or so after he died, when they opened him up, they didn't find a heart. They found very little soft tissue at all, maybe some darkened ligaments that still had you know, some soft tissue adhering, but basically they probably found close to a skeleton. So they had to make a decision. Was this guy a vampire and feeding on his family or not? And I think they decided, with no heart to burn, to err on the side of being conservative. They uprooted his legs, I believe, so that he could not leave the housing of his grave. They decapitated him to make sure he was dead and not just undead. I can't prove that because I don't have a precedent for it. But everything else broadly fits the vampire folk belief. Could he have been rearranged for another reason other than they thought he was a vampire? And the answer is yes. Regardless of what my students think, I wasn't there. I can't tell you specifically. All I could do is, based on the documentation we have as archaeologists, the recovery, the analysis, the science behind it all, and coupling that with the historical record and genealogy and everything else we had, create those test implications that best define it. And right now, this is the best explanation we have for why they went in and rearranged JB. But the other question is who was JB? You know, when we started all this research and first came upon the B family, you know, it was really very inconclusive. What we found in the area of Griswold, we found Bennetts. Remember, they even married into the Wilton family. We found Bishops, Burnhams, Browns, Bissells, Barbers. No Bellantonis. We didn't come over until the 20th century. But they were all living in Griswold at the same time. And so differentiating all these Bs, these British Bs, was very difficult for us at that time. But fortunately, we have DNA. And our colleagues down at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., and our colleagues at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office and their DNA identification lab, well, we ran his DNA. And we found that he came in the Y haplogroup, pretty predictably based on what we saw in the skeleton. That is, he's from Western Europe and very likely the United Kingdom. But then what they were able to do is take those markers and submit them. In fact, we did 2 different tests, DNA tests, and we submitted it to something called the Family Tree DNA R1B project. And this is kind of, you know, you guys that give your DNA, you know, to Ancestry and others, databases to see where you're from. It goes into these family databases now that we didn't have available back then. And when we ran it, the markers came up very close to a Barber family listed. In fact, both tests came up and matched a family called Barber. Katie Gagnon was one of our historical consultants here working with us on this. And she found in the Charles Hale Index, you know that, many of you that have done historic research, it's in the Connecticut State Library. It's the index of cemeteries in Connecticut, especially ancient burial grounds. That was done in the 1930s as part of a Roosevelt administration workforce to get the people working. Hale now came in and documented tombstones and cemeteries that some cases don't exist anymore or are so far worn, we can't read what's on them. But she found in the Hale Index for Griswold a John Barber, JB, whose son Nathan Barber, NB, died at 12 years of age in 1826, and appears that might be a match for MB13. Now we're off a year, aren't we? But that could be because of the way death was calculated and age was calculated back then, okay? I just had my 73rd birthday. Don't go spreading it around, but I had my 73rd birthday. I am now 73 years old. However, I have now started my 74th year. We don't count as 74 until we've completed the year. Okay? Back then, many cases, especially for the AE, Latin age of, it was calculated you were in the year of. So NB was in the year of 13, but had only celebrated 12 birthdays. Okay? So here's actually a portion of and if you follow my cursor, right in the middle here, dating August 16th, 1826, right time, right? Early 20th century, matches the coffin hardware. Here's a Nathan Barber, Griswold, son of John, dies on July 27th at 26 years, at 12 years of age. Wonderful. We need to do, we have had a hard time finding further evidences of the Barber, but working with our colleagues at the Griswold Historical Society, and particularly Mary DeVoe, who was a longtime town historian down there, she found this 1854 New London County map. Now, this is just a portion of the map showing the part of Griswold we're interested in. You see where Cutler's Brook comes through here? Okay, if you follow my cursor, okay, this, where I'm circling, is really on this map where the Wilton Cemetery was found. And just, if you can find, just to the kind of the southwest is the house of Henry Johnson. Now, it turns out that the Waltons purchased this land from a Samuel Johnson, Henry's grandfather, back in the 18th century. But 1854 now, his grandson owns the property. But here's our cemetery. Let's come down the road from Johnson, and what do we find? A house for J.S. Barber, right down the street. That's every indication they would have now used this cemetery right up the road that had been abandoned by the Wilton by the Wilton family. Cool stuff, ain't it? So when it was over, we were, and this was quite a while ago, once we had done the forensic work and so forth. One of my jobs, if you will, one of my responsibilities, I should say, as a state archaeologist, was to find family members. And I found them as far away, again, working with the genealogical societies, as far away as California, Nevada, many of which came back for a reunion and a reburial of their family ancestors. We put them in the ground, if you will, at a plot at Hopeville Cemetery in a safe place. And people are laying now next to the people they originally laid next to in the original cemetery. Reverend Bynon from the Congregational Church did a recommittal ceremony of Puritan tradition, and we reburied, put them back. All remains are reburied today, according to the cultural prescription of the people involved. If you are at all interested in this, Wesleyan University Press has come out with a second edition of Michael Bell's book, Food for the Dead, On the Trail of the New England Vampires. Best thing out there written on detailed, and he devotes a whole chapter to JB, even though at this time, when he wrote the book, we did not understand that he was a barber of the Barber family. Well, we get into the late 19th century, we now start having a more scientific answer for tuberculosis. Robert Conch discovers the mycobacteria, the germ now for it. And this is a time when, along the Connecticut coast, we see the development of tuberculosis sanitariums along the coast. Seaside Hospital in Waterford was an excellent example. And it was thought that the fresh air, the salt air, was good for tubercular victims. But now at least we have a scientific explanation for this disease. And of course, now we also have at this time period of kind of a more social explanation. And that is a British playwright by the name of Bram Stoker writes a book in 1897 called Dracula. And it has been, from the day it printed to this day, a bestseller. In America, as well as in Europe, they could not keep the book on the shelves. It was flying off so quickly. And of course, all of our concepts now of this idea of a vampire all stem from his novel, no matter how fictitious the novel might be. But what's interesting is when Bram Stoker died and they went through his papers, they found newspaper accounts from New England discussing the vampire folk belief. The same accounts Michael Bell would later find almost, 100 years later, describing. So when he wrote his book, he understood what was going on here in the concept of the undead and vampirism. And we're not the only ones that have vampires. There was one recently, archaeologists found a Venetian vampire. A woman that was buried with a brick in her mouth so she could no longer feed and chew on others. And the Dracula image has invaded popular culture, not only in movies, but in, Sesame Street teaches kids to count using the Count Dracula and Chocula. And every generation has to reinvent really the idea of the vampire. from Buffy and Twilight. And now they even got poor Abe Lincoln involved in this. I just don't understand that one at all. But, poor Abe. But the story never dies. There's a fascination of it. And that's why I'm still telling this 30 years later. But the question people ask, especially kids when I talk to them, is, are there really vampires? Well, there's an old maxim in anthropology that we say, and remember, we're all anthropologists on this. There's an old saying that goes like this: whatever is conceived of as reality is indeed reality, because we could see the consequences in human behavior. That is to say, our anthropologists and anthropological archaeologists are interested in human behavior. In other words, you believe something, you will act in a certain way of that belief system. And what you do as a consequence of your behavior, to me, is a reality. There was a guy in England, I think it's probably 15 years ago now, he would deathly feared vampires, believed in them. And every night he went to bed with 3 cloves of garlic in his mouth to ward off vampires while he slept. Well, one night, a clove of garlic dislodges and gets into his esophagus, and he suffocates to death. He dies in his sleep. Are there vampires? They got him. They got him. His belief produced a cause of action that led to his death. That is a reality to an anthropological archaeologist. So there are no vampires, but if you believe it, we'll see the consequences. They believed JB was a vampire. They went into his grave and they rearranged him. And to me, that is a reality. All right, guys, there's your lesson for the day. I'm gonna break down my. Okay, there you go.
Well, that was wonderful, Nick. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Sorry for the scientific bent on it, if there was one. I'm not.
Oh no, I love it.
So I'd be happy to answer any questions in the chat box. I wear the headphones, and some of you that know me know I have a loss of hearing from the service, and I don't hear very well. So if you do have a question, write it in the chat box. I saw that some of you put earlier questions up, and hopefully the presentation answered some of those. But if I didn't, retype them and we will get to them. So let's take a look at the first one. Interesting talk. That's not a question, but thank you. I really appreciate it. How are you? Be well too. Signing off. Who would do the digging up and rearranging of these graves in the community? Any record evidence that might tell us? We scorched the records. While there were newspaper accounts of what the Ray family did, there were no newspaper accounts or any records that we could find. This was not a town cemetery. This was a kind of a family burying ground, which there are many of in Eastern Connecticut. It may have been done quietly. It may have been done with just the family and some neighbors. But we really do not know who would have done this back then. We assume it was family and friends because they obviously, if the hypothesis is correct, they were trying to save the life of one of the family members, or they wouldn't have done this. Okay, so we assume it's a family and friends back, in the sometime in the early to mid 1800s that were doing it. Thank you. Are you also an expert on gravestone carving? I know a bit of the iconography of it. I am not an expert on carvers. If you really are looking for an expert on carvers, I would have you look up the Connecticut Gravestone Network. And in fact, Ruthie Brown was with you last week giving a presentation. And she is one of the foremost on carvers. So look up the Connecticut Gravestone Network. She would be a wonderful resource for you. Was tuberculosis the only disease that was attributed to vampires in New England? Yes, it's the only ones we have actual written records associated with. Could they have used it, for smallpox and other diseases? Probably. But the historical record that we have always seems to associate it with consumption. But certainly other diseases that were rampant and could not be administered to by the medical doctors at the time probably would have fallen under this kind of material too. Did other Barber family members die of TB also? That is a great question. Now, in terms of JB and IB, we did not find any signs of tuberculosis. However, one of the problems there was the degree of preservation. IB had no coffin, remember? And her rib cage, the rib bones are very thin. They are one of the first to decompose, and we did not, they weren't recovered enough to be able to look for the evidence, for the forensic evidence. NB had some ribs preserved, but we did not see it. Tuberculosis will only show up on hard tissue like bone if you have it in a chronic condition, okay? So you need to not only have tuberculosis, but you have to have been suffering from it for months, if not years, before you die. It invades your soft tissue pretty quickly, but getting into the hard tissue takes time. So NB, Nathan Barber, we think his name is now, if he had tuberculosis, maybe as an adolescent, he died much quicker, and hence it didn't show up on the hard tissue of the bone. So again, we're still trying to find more documentation on the family. And so hopefully at some point, we'll be able to get to some of those answers. But right now, we haven't been able to get to. Did it show up in Quebec? I don't know, the province in Canada, I'm assuming you're talking about, not Quebec quarters in Danielson, Connecticut. I do not think so. I don't know of any cases up there. Basically, Michael has found historical evidence of the vampire folk belief in southern Maine, and also Vermont and New Hampshire, but I do not know of any cases from Quebec. And while Michael has now about 40 or so cases that he could, historical references he could now talk to about, JB remains to date, if the hypothesis is correct, the only archaeological evidence for the vampire folk belief.
These are great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Nick, so much. This was such a pleasure having you this afternoon.
Well, we're happy to do it, and happy Halloween to everybody.
Yes, happy Halloween, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Nick. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.